One. Welcome to Hawley Local History Society. Today's presentation is by Dr. Judy Hill on the role of the workhouse in the early 19th century. For more information on Hawley local history, please visit hawleyhistory.org.uk.
So this is the question I'm going to put to you tonight. It's the role of the workhouse in the early 19th century. It's before 1834. And was it care or was it punishment? Now, if we look at the new Poor Law of 1834, it came about as a result of the report of the State of the Poor of 1832. And it talked about a ramshackle local welfare system that was just not working. They talked about unregulated poorhouses, how there was terrible idleness and immorality, and how the system had totally broken down, and that relief bills were spiraling. So, and there was nothing, well, all criticism. Now, when historians actually looked at poverty at the beginning of the 19th century, they only looked at primary records, but state records. They didn't look really at local records in the way that we do in the last 20 years. And what we will see is people like the Webbs, for example, their comments also were very, very critical about the pre-1834 workhouse. And they said how it was overcrowded, filthy, indecency, you name it, it was all there. Now, why was the big change made in 1834? Well, if you look at this, if you look at population, how from 1801, it goes from 10.5 million to 37 million. And also, if you look at how, late 17th, I should say 18th, I should have seen it, late 18th century, 25% of the population lived in urban areas. By the late 19th century, it was 75% that were in cities. Now, with rapid urbanization, how do you deal with all these people when it comes to poverty and so on? And this really was a crisis point. So we see something like this. So the new Poor Law changed things totally. We will see actually that the Act of 1834 really, it wanted to centralize the relief system, lessen the eligibility, those that could receive money, and really the workhouses were really to be a deterrent. They were to be so awful you wouldn't want to go into them. So this is what we'll see. So we go from parish relief to union relief, and we get large union workhouses. And in fact, the new workhouses really resemble prisons or bastilles. So we get something like this from 1834 onwards. And of course, we remember Oliver Twist and Charles Dickens and so on. But what I'm going to look at now is workhouses before 1834, and were they such a terrible place? Let's look at them, because really what they really are places or institutions for people to really rescue them from the worst calamities as such. So let's just see now how it was. Well, just very briefly, we've got to go back to Elizabeth I's reign. And that's when the Poor Law was actually codified at the end of her reign, that the whole idea was that parishes were to have a legal obligation to look after the poor. So it goes right back to 1598. And what we will see is that parishes were to punish vagrants and the undeserving poor, as they were seen. Now, the legislation doesn't really establish who's deserving and who isn't, but we will see it's the beginning of the system. And if you weren't happy, you could appeal to the Court of Sessions. So under the Elizabethan statute, and this will go right through actually 1834, that you raise money from the poor rates. The overseers of the poor raise money from the poor rates on land and on property. And then with that money, you look after the poor of your parish. Now, the key is that the overseers were responsible for estimating the local need. Depending on the need, you make the rate, you collect the money, and then you look after the poor. But we will see there'll be a crisis in this. There are increasing problems. The problem is that we see a huge increase in poverty, and I'll explain in a minute why. So some parishes start select vestries, and here's this is a kind of a critique of it. The ideas being that they try to cut down on relief, and they were very, very unpopular indeed. So what we see, and we see this in Sussex, and we see it really across the whole of the southeast, is that an increasing poverty problem really from 1784 onwards. And what we see is a lot of seasonal unemployment. We get an expanding casual day labour force with enclosure. We also see if you have day labour, you don't employ them in the winter for agricultural workers and so on. We get population growth. We get higher prices. We also get the decline of domestic industries, which is very interesting because with industrialization, small domestic industries in the south go into decline. You also see the abandonment of living in to a certain degree. And as a result, actually, hardship on the poor and in the parishes does increase. Now, I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but to such an extent, we get the swing riots, of course, which is very, very important in 1832. And of course, Sussex was really badly affected by the swing riots, most definitely, and Surrey, of course. All the southern counties were affected badly by it, and it caused a lot of tension in the parishes. The other thing that was being lost, which is very interesting, and this is only being recognised how important this is, again, in the last, I would say, 15 years, the importance of makeshift activities with enclosure and so on. What we will see is that the poor are losing grazing rights, fuel collection, and it affects their independence. So in other words, you will appeal for poor relief from the parish more often. Now, what we will see, we talk about life cycle poverty. It doesn't mean people were getting relief all the time. What we will see is that about 85% of relief came from, example, childhood, parenthood, and then old age. They seem to be the keys, most definitely. And so these spiraling relief costs were a real problem, because what it was showing was that the owners and the occupiers of land were finding it difficult to pay, because they were being affected by this inflation and this economic recession as well. And of course, after 1815, you get demobilization after the Napoleonic Wars. And so what we will see is that there are deficits in the collection of poor rates. And so if there's deficits in the collection, how can you provide the relief? And so what I want to try and show you this evening is how the administrators try to really cope with the problems of unemployment, illness, old age, death, and so on. We'll be looking at this actually, and I've got lots of examples. Now, this is the same, this is for Surrey, but it's the same for Sussex actually, that in the south, the expenditure on poor relief was actually greater than the national. The total expenditure on poor relief is in blue, and Surrey is in pink. And for Sussex, it was the same. In the south, in all southern counties, it was greater than the national amount that was being paid. Now, if we look at workhouses, and I'll just use Surrey as an example, and I'll go on to Sussex in a minute. In Surrey, there were 70 workhouses. Now, I think in Sussex, there are about 480. There was many, many more. And if we see actually that the parishes would maintain the poor in the workhouse. Now, there was different ways of doing it. There's Surrey, and if you can see how small some of these parishes are. Sometimes they amalgamated. For example, they went into unions and they amalgamated, and exactly the same happened in Sussex. Very small parishes came together to have a workhouse as such, and they're known as Gilbert unions. It's the result of the 1782 Act. But they weren't intended to help the able-bodied. They were really intended only to help the elderly, sick, the orphaned, and so on, and the infirm. The able-bodied, on a short-term basis, were expected really to be relieved in their homes. The problem is, because of the crisis point we see at the beginning of the 19th century, that attitudes towards the poor most definitely harden. They are stigmatized, they are pauperized, and really the political climate really shifts away from sympathy and compassion to looking upon the needy as idle, lazy, feckless, you name it. So this is the change that we will actually see. That's just showing you parishes coming together to appoint one workhouse as such. The same for Sussex too. I've just put a few down here, some Gilbert unions in Sussex in 1782. And you can see how small parishes came together and formed Gilbert Union workhouses. Now, I'm talking about very small buildings, really. If we look at this one, this is just one example, but this is in Albury, and this could accommodate 18 people. So we're talking about very, very small workhouses as such. Epsom Workhouse, that could take 60 people. And then the Farnham Workhouse could even take more. Now, if you want to try and quantify, and this applies to all research actually, if you really want to try and quantify who were in the workhouse and who were outside the workhouse, you can look at parliamentary returns. But the problem is with the parliamentary returns, they ask different questions. You get different answers. I'll explain how this works. The other thing is that locally, a lot of parishes destroyed their records before 1834. They didn't actually have to keep them, and a lot of local records were actually destroyed. And parishes that actually have kept them, they've all kept different bits, and of course they're now in record offices. But there's not one story. Researching after 1834 is a very different picture. You have much more available to you. So this is the problem, that when we look at how many is being relieved, they're not asking the same question. And I'll just show you what I mean. For example, this is 1776, and these are the places available. Now, if you look at it, if you look at places like Bermondsey, look, these are big. These are big. But if you look at other parishes, they're quite small. I mean, they are quite small, depending on the size of the parish. But if we look at the London parishes like Newington, again, 200, much bigger. Southwark, 150. And then again, this is going on. You can see, look, Southwark here, St. Saviour's, a workhouse could take 600. So huge numbers. And these are Sussex numbers. And you can see, you know, some are down to 10, some are up to 40. But these are the places available. And here's some more. And more. I mean, there's many more workhouses. Rye here, look, 60. That's quite big, actually. Yeah. And more. But if you look at this with me, if you look at England and Wales, you can look at the percentage of workhouses relief per population. Well, it's quite interestingly, if you look at receipt of poor relief, it's about 11%. It goes down and will then increase. If you look at those permanently relieved in a workhouse, it's under 1% nationally. If you look at it in Surrey, you can see it's higher because, of course, we haven't got industrialization. The north at this time was richer. But look at the number in receipt of poor relief, 33% in the county. It drops. And then we can see actually 18, and it will increase then. And then those permanently in a workhouse, about 5%. So those are figures for Surrey, and it goes across the southeast like this. Now, if we just look at this, what you can see is, and this is why the returns are different. These are the numbers that could be in a workhouse. These are the places they've got. But if you look at the actual, inmates in the workhouse, we will see actually that it's interesting to look at this one in 1834, because if you look at Epsom, it could take 90, but it actually had 80. Farnham could take 300, but it had 58. Whitley could take 80, but it had 40. And it's across the board. So what you can see is it's not a favorite place to actually be. It's not somewhere people really want to be. This is a bit clearer. So this is the available accommodation, and this is the number of people in the workhouse. Now, who was in the workhouse? Well, as I've said, it's the elderly, the sick, the pregnant, the young, and the impotent poor. And I love this term, the worn out people. A haven of last resort, really, that have nobody to look after them, incapable of work. And of course, if you think at this time, people really in agricultural areas, especially like parts of rural Surrey and Sussex, would actually work till they could work no longer. So it's a refuge, most definitely. And sometimes they wanted to take expensive paupers really off the outdoor pension list and put them in a workhouse because they were so expensive. And there are examples, and this is letters. Now, these have come from local record office. This has come from Surrey Record Office. But this note here was just in the back of a lot of letters. I mean, they've not been catalogued. They're just bits that have actually survived. It's quite interesting. And if you can see this, as she's saying here, Elizabeth Elizabeth is saying she would rather starve than go into the house, because they didn't want it. Now, why didn't she want to go into the house? What's the reason? Well, we'll look at that in a minute. And in fact, this couple were told they had to move from their cottage. They wouldn't pay the rent on the cottage anymore, and they had to go into the workhouse. And the order had to be carried out. So, as I said, it's insanity, affliction, disabled, the young, deserted, unmarried, widowed mothers often. Now, the problem was that able-bodied males that entered a workhouse were really seen in a very bad way. They were seen as worthless, and they shouldn't be in the workhouse as such. There was the attitude, there's no sympathy as such. And we will see this actually. You can see this, that Maclean, who wrote the report on Surrey, said that of the 73 inmates in the Dorking workhouse, there were 4 able-bodied, and he said they're in different characters. Look, they're bad workmen, and they've been put there because they thought it was cheaper to put them into the house, so they're real trouble. And we've got others. I've got comments from Sussex. Again, East Grinstead, they had a real problem by these inmates. The single men that were being placed there were doing no work. They wouldn't even draw a bucket of water, and they were lolling. So, you know, Wisborough Green, they were noisy and troublesome. But they don't tell us how many. This is the frustrating thing. We don't know how many there. But you can see actually how this attitude was hardening, most definitely. What we will see, orphaned or pauper children were relieved, often relieved in a workhouse, most definitely, and they made up a lot of the population of the workhouse. We will see actually, especially from the age 14 to 19. And Stephen King, in his research on poverty, has said that really this age group, 10 to 19, really nationally is the bulk of the workhouse population. And give you some idea, you can see it here. This is one workhouse and a breakdown. Well, really, you'd think that, you know, these people 20 to 50 shouldn't really be in the workhouse. They should be working if possible. And then Sussex, for example, there's a few examples here. The number of adults and the number of children. And the whole idea was, it's a bit unclear, it's come out of the Times, but the whole idea was to try and apprentice young, those especially over 10, to apprentice them out of the workhouse, either shoemakers, tailors, as such. And this is the vestry of Epsom asking what trades could take healthy boys now in the workhouse. And you can also see the length of time people have stayed. Now, these bits of information really just came, it took me 5 years to find some of this information, just going through all the records in the Surrey History Centre and coming across kind of gems of information. Like if you look at how long people would stay as such, actually. So you can see it. And there's the Epsom workhouse there. And this is a very interesting sheet I actually found. And I think it really epitomizes who was in the workhouse. For the whole of the south of England, you can see this. So in Epsom, in the years 20 to 35, there were 9 between 0 and 9. And the reasons why they're there is given. Now, I don't say this is very politically correct in today's language, but we've got orphans, we've got bastards, and the reason being that the mother's worthless here. And so we're given a list. 10 to 19, we have got somebody who's disorderly, disease usually meant syphilis, pregnant, father was in the army, again, father in the army, another person's there because the mother's worthless, father in the army, bastard, two daughters of a smuggler. I mean, how about that then? And then you've got a bastard and an orphan. 20 to 39 is very interesting, actually, because these are here, look, because of sickness, really, or a mental problem. So you've got a bad disorder, doctor doesn't define it, leprosy and an idiot. Again, we've got an idiot, and a lunatic. I'm not sure the exact difference there, but what we can see is it's mental problems. And then 50 to 59, we've got somebody who's worthless, again, because they're not working, so they're seen as worthless, lunatic, paralytic, and feeble. And then 60 to 69, again, cripple, stupid, deformed, diseased, stupid. I mean, a 69-year-old with no regular habits of industry anyway, and then sickly. But I love the over 70. Now, if we consider over 70, I mean, he's very elderly at this time, but you've got somebody, you've got paralytic, asthmatic, unsteady, worn out, impotent, and aged. What I'd like to know is why is only one worn out? We're not told, but you know, the only one is defined as worn out. I mean, aren't they all worn out at that age? If you think they've worked all their life, they must be all worn out. But anyway, it's only one that gets that definition as such. And if you look at the comparison between indoor and outdoor relief, you can see that outdoor relief will be greater, because the whole idea was you don't expect to give it to them every week. You only hope to give it to them intermittently when they fall on hard times, or in the winter there's no employment, and so on. But this is the crisis, because after 1815, what we will see is that the workhouses are not full. They're really not the appropriate answer for short-term unemployment, of course. Outdoor relief is much better. Indoor relief is more expensive, it's inflexible, and so on. And it's about 4 times more expensive to relieve a pauper in a workhouse as opposed to outside. But the problem was, and we'll see, and this gives you an example, that indoor relief was usually set at this. So that's quite a lot of money. So that would be 13 shillings a week, whereas out of the workhouse, she only got 6 shillings. So you can see they really want to keep people out as such. And here's, look, trying to remove people because of the cost. Now, the problem is mentally ill. Now, we will see actually there are a lot of people that are mentally ill in the workhouse. In Surrey, there isn't a county asylum till 1841 in Wandsworth. And in fact, we will see Brookwood in Woking is 1867. So in fact, the workhouse was the place where a lot of these people ended up. The problem was to send them to licensed private asylums was very, very expensive. It was about 10 shillings a week, where a workhouse would be about 4 and 6. So on the whole, parishes didn't send many as such. Hoxton House in Shoreditch was a big example, but it was very expensive. So parishes try to keep the mentally ill really within the parish, and it's only when they were desperate that they actually did send them as such. And there are some examples. for example, there's an example here that this parish, Sheldon, sent this chap who was mentally ill to Hoxton House, and they ended up with a huge bill of £7, 17 shillings and sixpence for 10 weeks care. And then they had to pay for his funeral and so on. It was very, very expensive indeed. So they didn't do it. The other problem that all parishes had at this time was actually vagrants and casual paupers. What we'll see, especially with the end of the French wars and so on, there was a depression, an increase in casual paupers passing through parishes. And actually, on the whole, they wanted to move them on. You see this in Sussex as well, actually, especially on main roads to the ports. Some parishes even had what's known as beggar drivers to move them on, because if they were taken sick while they were in your parish, you had to care for them, or if a woman was to give birth as such, that was a real problem. So it was a great expense indeed, actually. So you're trying to move them on and discourage them from stopping in your parish. Some large parishes like Guildford had a place in the high street where they actually put them overnight and then moved them on the next day. You didn't want them to stay as such. Now, what about putting them to work? Well, if you look at what I've shown you for Epsom, and that is really a very good example, how are work schemes going to work? This is the question. Well, the idea was you should set everybody to work. The ethos was everybody should work. It would be good if they could manufacture, they could spin, they could do whatever. Now, what we will see is by 1834, so many of these workrooms were actually dismantled. The reason being the people weren't up to it. I mean, the people really weren't up to it. In fact, the young children, they could send out of the workhouse, which they did, to farmers or to local mills and so on. And this became more common. And if you look at this, this is a very good example, actually. This is, these are the workhouses here. These are the number in them in 1803. This is the money they earned. This is the money purchasing materials. Now look at the deficit. And some do better than others, but you can see actually, look at this. This is money earned in the house. This is pretty good, actually. This one is pretty good, but they're not all very good at all. It just depended actually what they were doing. This is again money earned in the house. Some money is being earned in 1803 here. And here's some more that shows you. And again, there will be deficits. Some do succeed. Dorking didn't do very well. Some do better. It depends what they were actually trying to manufacture or make. So when you look at the employment of workhouse poor, what we will see is that it wasn't totally successful. By 1834, it's not working so well. It really works better if you can have a garden. This worked well if you could put people to work in a productive garden with the workhouse. And this actually was quite successful because they're providing vegetables and so on for the house. And these are some work schemes in Sussex that they tried. We don't have the amounts, not all the amounts they earn, but it gives you some idea. Some of it is spinning, knitting stockings, sacking, rope, and so on. Spinning, they tried. Oops, sorry. And you've got farm work down here. So it gives you some idea. Got 5 errand boys here in Lewes. It's quite interesting, actually. You can see what they tried. And there's some more productive gardens as such. So Now, how was the workhouse, how was it run? Well, it was run over the century in different ways. We will see actually that sometimes they farmed out the responsibility to somebody and said, well, you run it, we'll give you a certain amount in the parish and we'll run it like that. That was one way. Another way was to give a contractor a lump sum. And this was very popular because the contractors did quite well out of it, actually, indeed. I think they did quite well out of it. So because of the crisis at the beginning of the 1800s, parishes start to change the way they wanted to govern the house. And how they actually did it was to parochial manage it themselves and to appoint a salaried governor. Now, this didn't actually go down very well, actually, because we will see actually that as an example here in Thames Ditton, this Mrs. Auburn, she'd run the house on a per capita basis. And I think she'd done quite well. They then wanted to give her a fixed sum, and she writes many letters complaining that this wasn't the way she wanted to do it. So what we will see actually, this is how it was done to try and cut down expenses. Now, do we have any complete records really of living conditions in a workhouse before 1834? Not really. It's by collating lots of bits that we can try and put something together. I'll just show you now. You've got rule books, you've got inventories, you've got some plans, you've got some pictures, and you've also got diet. And it's quite interesting, actually, if you look at the diet, it's pretty good. If you compare it to what some of the poor agricultural workers were having out of the workhouse, they probably didn't have as much meat. This is Thames Ditton. And if you look at it, it's not bad at all. And there are others. For example, if we look at Sussex, Brighton is meant to have one of the most generous diets in the country. They had 3 meals a day and no limit. So, and 6 meat days. Well, that's quite something actually, as such. And East Preston had 6 meat dinners. And it goes on. And if you look at Uckfield, hot dinners, meat puddings and boiled beef. So it is quite something. Now, I won't go through all the rules with you, but they are pages long, and you often find these in record offices, how the workhouse is to be governed, how the mistress and master is to be sober, how you're not to take cuts really from the butcher or so on and so on, how bills are to be paid, and it goes on and on. I'll just show you some of them. But it goes how they're to sit and have their meals, how grace is to be said, and children, are to work if they can, and so on. So the parish would be very, very controlling. The overseers of the parish would really want these to work well, and it goes on. And of course, church on Sunday. The master was to keep weekly accounts, and it would go to the overseers of the parish and they would look at them. And another thing you can look at to find out, and this again is in local offices, but to find out how big a workhouse is, that when the new poor law came in 1834, before that, all poor houses had to do an inventory. Now, all of these have not survived, but this one has survived for Egham. Now, if you look, you can see that these people probably shared a bed. They would share a bed, but it tells you in this room what was there. Well, you can see most of it is worn out. There's not much furniture, but it's pretty well worn. It's pretty well worn, and it goes on. And this explains actually what is actually there, and it shows you how many rooms there are as such. Lots of things need repair. You will see this, but it gives you some idea of what, I mean, there is bedding as such, but a lot of it is worn out, is worn out, and it goes on. I mean, this has 11 rooms, and you can see there's 2 usually per room. Again, it wants repair. And then you've got a store cupboard. You've got a bedroom for the sick. It's quite interesting actually how you can see exactly what is kept. And these are the women's bedrooms, and they also shared as well, very similar. You wonder why they couldn't have repaired it, but maybe that's again showing you that they didn't have the ability, or the inmates couldn't do it as such. But again, it gives you some idea what's there. And then you've got other things here. Got lying in rooms and so on. And then you've got a committee room. So again, it shows you how big this workhouse would have been. And if you look, actually, you've got a lunatic jacket here. This would be, of course, to restrain somebody. And you've got, look, baby linen. You've got the funeral pails. It gives you a very good picture of what actually was there. And then it goes on to tell you about outside as well, and the kitchen and the chest and so on. And again, the word that keeps coming up is repair, but it gives you, again, gives you some idea. So it gives you a very good insight if you can find resources like this. And then it gives you an inventory of their clothes. And it's quite interesting. They seem to have quite a lot of clothes, but not in a very good state of repair. And in fact, what they do, if somebody died, they would pass on the clothes to somebody else. But it gives you some idea what was there, how many pairs of breeches they've got. They want washing, or they want mending, or whatever. But again, it's a very, very, very good historical site. And then it goes on. And then you've got the ladies. And again, it tells us a lot about what the ladies wore and what they had. So it's a good historical source, actually. And if you take an inventory of a cottage outside the workhouse, what you can see is that really it's quite similar. You know, it is quite similar in many ways. So to conclude, and I'll take questions, the Poor Law Commission then in their report described this workhouse, really, all the reports that came back, really, they looked at it in a way as really a hardening attitude, that really that the able-bodied were being maintained, that really they cannot, the parishes cannot afford to actually keep the poor. And I think after the riots, the swing riots of 1832, there was a great deal of unrest. We will see actually a great deal of unrest and a fear, could the parishes afford to look after all the sick, the aged, the young within the parish? And here you've got actually, these are some of the conclusions of the report. This is from Sussex. And it's saying that, you know, this is what the commissioners found in certain Sussex workhouses. But if you think we've got 480 workhouses about in Sussex, and we're not going to see a lot of detrimental things. But there's some. There was one, Ardingly, the worst parish, sick and aged, neglected, clothed in tattered garments, and so on. Where Uckfield was really excessively comfortable. So as such. So what we can see is that the pre-1834 workhouse was really shaped by local communities, and getting relief was enacted really in vestries with the overseers of the poor. Now, really, a lot of the overseers of the poor were farmers, they were carpenters, but by 1834, most parishes had started to appoint assistant overseers of the poor and pay them. They were more professional as such, actually. So what they were trying to do was really to provide for the poor in their parish, but there was a crisis point. So what we will see is that I think that from all the research I have done and looking at all these local studies, that I think the administrators of the old poor law were really trying to cope in a humane manner with the problems of indigence, unemployment, illness, old age, and death. But the system will change. And especially after the riots of 1832 and so on, we will see that attitudes to the poor really hardens. And the whole idea is that really that the able-bodied in particular should be punished. The 1834 Act, most definitely, we will see actually it sought to centralize relief, set up union workhouses, so not on a parish system, less eligibility, and also to make the workhouse a deterrent, much more of a deterrent than we see from before 1834. So, so my question really is actually that, you know, with all its inadequacies, we're looking at the pre-1834 workhouse today, what we're seeing is that it did fulfill a certain social need. Was it, and it did provide shelter for the vulnerable. The report of 1832, the commissioner's report, was extremely critical, but really, is it the total picture? That's the question. And I think we'd have to say no. They picked on certain things because they wanted the new Act of 1834, which of course did happen. So let me stop this, come off that. That's it, and come back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Judy. I'm sure we've all learned a lot this evening that we didn't know. Are you an expert on what happened in workhouses in the later part of the 19th century? Or
yes, yes, it's a very different picture. I mean, it's a very, very different picture because it's totally centralized and it is controlled by central government.
Yeah,
it's a totally different picture, and it is punishment. The whole idea is to really the fact that you're in a workhouse, that you're less eligible. Yeah. That really is a different talk, but that is looking at less eligibility. So you are, you know, yeah.
I mean, a lot of us here are sort of well into advanced years, and my grandparents were born in the 1880s.
Yes.
Or the early 1880s.
Yes.
And I think looking into my family history, I found an instance of my grandfather being in a workhouse.
Yes.
For a short while. And I wonder if you could just throw some light on what were the commonest reasons for that in the late 1800s.
I mean, it's very difficult. Whereabouts was it? Whereabouts is
that
it?
Was in Islington.
Right. Okay. in London, well, it probably was something to do with either illness, unemployment, sickness most definitely played a part there. The problem was that going into a workhouse, it wasn't really for a very short time. This is the problem with the after 1834. People were put into a workhouse, but it was difficult to get out. You know, how are you going to look for work if you're in a workhouse? It was a real problem. I would think probably it could have been sickness, because by 1880, they did have separate wards. A lot of the London ones in particular did, a lot of the city ones had separate wards for sickness.
Yeah.
You know, they had hospital wards as such. I would think it would be something like that.
It's very, very interesting to look through the reasons for commitment in the examples you showed, because my wife was looking through those and she could find half a dozen reasons why I should have gone into a workhouse.
Thank you for watching this recording. Hawley Local History Society meets in the Regent Hall in Albert Road, Hawley, every fourth Thursday of the month. For more information, please visit the website hawleyhistory.org.uk.